On the 10th of November 1865, a commander of a former prisoner of war camp during the American Civil War was brought to the gallows for his execution. He was a man who was paraded in front of the crowds and guardsmen who looked on, but his execution did not go well. During the American Civil War, there were a number of prisoner of war camps set up. One of these was Andersonville Prison, or Camp Sumter, and it was a site which was known for its inadequate food and water supply, and also terrifying and disgusting conditions. Inside of the camp, 45,000 Union prisoners were held, and around 13,000 died due to the diseases that spread. But one man held responsible for this was Henry Wirz, who was an experienced military officer, and he was condemned to death as a war criminal. Join us today as we look at the execution of the American Civil War Commandant, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Henry Wirz was born as Hartmann Heinrich Wirz on the 25th of November 1823 in Switzerland. He was given a good education, and one day he wanted to be a doctor, but his family did not have the money to be able to pay for his medical studies. But he then became a merchant in Turin, and following a few years he worked in a store in Zurich. He was a married man and he had 2 children, but in 1847 he would be sent to prison for 4 years. He was charged with fraud and embezzlement, and he was then released the following years and was sent in exile for 12 years. He first went to Moscow before he then went to America, where he worked inside of a factory. But he then began to work in a doctor's as an assistant, and he would be able to perform small-scale surgeries and also other jobs such as casting broken bones. He tried to set up his own medical practice, but in 1861 the American Civil War broke out. At this time Henry Wirz was a 37-year-old, and he was a private who enlisted in Company A of the 4th Battalion of Louisiana Infantry in the Confederate Army. He saw service in a number of key battles, including the Battle of Seven Pines, where he worked as an assistant to the general, and during this he was wounded by a bullet, and he lost the use of his right arm. But there is some debate about his injury, as there are other accounts that state that this occurred on a 6,000-mile mission to track down records of prisoners. But after a period of recovery, Henry Wirz was promoted to captain, and he was said to have been given this for bravery on the battlefield. But he was then assigned to the staff of General John H. Winder due to his injury, and this general was in charge of the Confederate prisoner of war camps, and Wirz served as his assistant. Captain Henry Wirz was treated almost as a special envoy, and he would during the Civil War be sent to Europe to carry different messages to commissioners in England and in France. But when he got back he continued to work inside of the prison department, and he would continue to work inside a prison in Alabama as a commandant, before he would then rule over his own huge camp. In February 1864, the Confederate government created Camp Sumter, which was a large military prison camp found near to the small railroad depot of Andersonville in southwest Georgia. This camp was to house prisoners of war, and in April 1864 Henry Wirz arrived, and he was the commandant of the camp and the prison there. The camp had not been made to its full plans, and as thousands of Union prisoners arrived it quickly got overwhelmed, and despite wooden barracks being planned, the prisoners were held in vast open-air stockades, and prisoners had no cover in the camp. The conditions of Andersonville prison were horrific and were brutal, and one prisoner said of the camp, "As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror, and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were vermin that once had been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere skeletons covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with earnestness, 'Can this be hell? God protect us!' and all thought that he alone could bring them out alive from such a terrible place. In the centre of the whole camp was a swamp, occupying about 3 or 4 acres of the narrowed limits, and a part of this marshy place had been used by prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the ground, the centre rising from which was suffocating. The ground allotted to our 90 was near the edge of this plague spot, and how we were to live through the warm summer weather in the midst of such fearful surroundings was more than we cared to think of just then. The camp was truly terrible, and the conditions were shocking, and there was a small fence known as a deadline, and this was no man's land to keep prisoners away from the walls. Anyone who crossed this line was shot dead without any warning, but there were many problems at the camp with food. There was a huge shortage, as the Confederate soldiers themselves were struggling to find it, but the prisoners became emaciated and began to suffer from scurvy. Further prisoners died from dysentery and typhoid fever due to the filthy living conditions, and the only source of drinking water was from the creek, which was also the camp toilet. It was filled at times with dead bodies and human waste, but this was the only water that would be available. Prisoners slept in tents, and during times of rough weather, this would not be good, as they had no suitable clothing. During summer 1864, the Union prisoners suffered horrifically from hunger exposure and disease, and around a third had died from dysentery and scurvy, and many were then buried in mass graves. The best chance that the prisoners had of surviving this was to have a good social network that provided them with moral support and also supplies. There was a group known as the Andersonville Raiders, who attacked other prisoners and stole food and jewellery. These were armed with clubs, and they would even kill. Some would later be hanged for this, but the conditions at the camp were so bad that Commandant Henry Wirz asked prisoners to deliver a petition to try and reinstate prisoner exchanges, to stop overcrowding at the camp, but this was turned down. But inside of the camp there were 13,000 prisoners that died, and most died from the Confederate policy towards prisoners of war, and it was ultimately Henry Wirz's camp, and he was seen as the person who was responsible for enforcing this brutal policy. But because of these conditions, Wirz would later be arrested, and he was then taken by train to Washington, D.C., where he was held in the old Capitol Prison, and he was placed on trial for his treatment of Union prisoners of war. He was tried in front of a special military commission, and this took place between the 23rd of August and the 18th of October, 1865. It was said that he was charged with combining, confederating, and conspiring together with John H. Winder, Richard B. Winder, Joseph Isaiah H. White, W. S. Winder, R. R. Stevenson, and others unknown, to injure the health and destroy the lives of prisoners and soldiers in the military service of the United States, then held and being prisoners of war within the lines of the so-called Confederate States, and in the military prisons thereof, to the end that the armies of the United States might be weakened and impaired in violation of the laws and customs of war, and is also accused for violation of the laws of war to impair and injure the health and destroy the lives by subjecting to torture and great suffering, by confining in unhealthy and unwholesome quarters, by exposing to the inclemency of winter and to the dews and burning sun of summer, by compelling the use of impure water, and by furnishing insufficient and unwholesome food of large numbers of federal prisoners. He was also accused of participating in 13 acts of murder, and also stomping and kicking victims and forcing prisoners into the stocks. Many witnesses testified, but others said he did not specifically kill prisoners himself. Henry Wirz was found guilty, and for this he was sentenced to death. On the 10th of November 1865, Henry Wirz, who was guarded by 4 companies of soldiers, was led to the gallows in the old Capitol Prison yard. Around 250 spectators had received government-issued tickets, and they were watching on towards the gallows. He was led to the stairs, and was led up them, and the spectators screamed and chanted, "Remember Andersonville." A hood was then placed over his head by the executioner, and the rope was fastened around his neck. His last words were that he was being executed for simply following orders. But at 10:32 a.m, the trapdoor was released, and the rope stretched under Wirz's weight, and he was not killed by a broken neck, but instead he slowly strangled to death. The crowd cheered that he had died, as they had been made aware of the conditions of Andersonville, and many despised the condemned man, and the public wanted vengeance. After his execution, permission was given to rebury his body alongside the Lincoln assassins, but it was discovered that during the autopsy his right arm and part of his neck and head had been removed, and Wirz had 2 of his vertebrae removed, and these were placed inside of a museum. There are many questions regarding his trial, and some say that it was not a fair one, and that his death sentence was not justified, but the conditions he held prisoners inside of at Andersonville were brutal and barbaric. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.